Okay, I don't think I see anyone here. I am live. I love that I can't see anyone, but everyone can see me. That's very comfortable. If anyone is out there, welcome, welcome, welcome. If this is your first time, this is our 19th webinar in our series to educate family and family of the individuals that are with us in treatment and community. My name's Kyle Miller. I'm one of the clinical supervisors here at our Pottsville location. I want to thank everyone for being here today. This is a topic I'm really interested in. It's relatable, it's hard hitting, it's relevant, it's sensitive to a lot of us. The opioid epidemic is so relevant right now. And I think we could all relate to this topic one way or another, whether it be through personal experience with opioids or someone close to us that may be struggling with it. So, again, I want to welcome everyone for being here. If you have any questions as we move through the slides, feel free to put them below in the chat, and I'll get to them at the end. The agenda. So we're going to look at some of the terminology used when we're talking about different opioids. We're also going to look at the opioid epidemic, some history and events that led to it, and where it's at today. Is the opioid epidemic getting better? Is it getting worse? We're also going to take a look at the different contributors to opiate use disorder, who's most at risk and affected, and how has that been diagnosed? We'll go through the exact criteria that the DSM-5 uses, so you know what red flags to look for when determining opiate use disorder. We'll look at the overdose risks associated with opiate use disorder. We'll look at the brain and its role in addiction and continued use. And lastly, we'll look at treatment for opiate use disorder, what that looks like, and some medications that are available and used regularly. So what is opiate use disorder? Simply put, opiate use disorder is the physical and the psychological dependence to opioids. Physical and psychological dependence. This separates opioids from other substances. Those physical withdrawal symptoms that accompany opioid dependence are arguably the worst of all substances. It's incredibly discomforting and an added layer of difficulty when we talk about separating ourselves from this drug. And just like other forms of substance use disorders, it's considered a chronic disease of the brain that results in continued use despite harmful consequences. And you could use that definition for any substance use disorder. It's continued use despite those negative and harmful consequences. And in more chronic cases, the cravings for opioids are considered uncontrollable. It's a very important point. Tough sell, not a lot of people believe that, and something I'll talk about in a little bit when we discuss the brain. But what are opioids really? Opioids are a class of drug that derive from or mimic natural substances found in the opium poppy plant. Opioids work in the brain to kill pain and create euphoria. The term opioid is really an umbrella term to describe all synthetic, semi-synthetic, and natural opioids, all of which work in the brain the same. They produce pain and euphoria. I'm sorry, they prevent pain, they kill pain, and produce euphoria. Opiates, on the other and yes, this is also where the seeds come from on your everything bagel or the bread that you might have had this morning. Opiates are considered a relatively short list. On that list is pure opium, obviously, heroin, that's derived naturally from opium, morphine and codeine, which I find interesting. Morphine and codeine are still used in the medical field today and are still produced. I don't know why they derive them from the opium poppy plant and they don't just make them synthetically. Seems like a few extra steps or harder. But nonetheless, natural opiates does not mean that they are healthier or less potent or in any way, shape, or form better for you. It is simply just a term and what they are derived from. Yeah. Okay. This is where I think the confusion begins, right? And something you need to understand when looking at the current opioid epidemic. There are over 500 opioids produced by the pharmaceutical industry. Are they to blame for this epidemic? Maybe. But blame aside, I think our shortcomings stems from a lack of understanding for what an opioid is, which is really the thesis of this webinar. It's to educate people and better equip themselves to make their own decisions and come to their own conclusions. And I don't say that to patronize or to condescend, but rather to empathize. This is my profession, and I'm still confused. If we look at the list of these synthetic and semi-synthetic opioids, and just off the top of my head, Demerol, Opana, Lepramide, hydrocodone, oxycodone, hydromorphone, hydrochloride. All of these drugs have varying potencies and varying brand names. And the point is, I think most people don't understand what they're taking or the risks associated with it. So I encourage you to always do your own research, talk to a professional, discuss this in depth with your doctor, ask hard-hitting specific questions, because the nomenclature of the opioid class of drugs is a nightmare. In this next slide, I linked this flowchart to give you an idea as to some of the potencies of different opioids. What we see is that people who go on to use illicit opioids, 85% of them start by using prescription opioids legally and rightfully prescribed by a qualified physician. So this is why the opioid use disorder is so complicated. There's this misconceived belief different somehow. And they are different. I think the vast majority of us believe that they are more different than they are alike. And that's just not true. They're more alike than they are different. Let me put it this way. Prescription opioids is to heroin and fentanyl as beer is to liquor. Prescription opioids is to heroin and fentanyl as beer is to liquor. And you could quote me on that. But the truth is that not all opioids are created equal, but they do act in the brain the same way, and that's what's important. The brain does not see a difference. Here I broke this chart down a little further and linked some of the more common prescription opioids that you might find prescribed. I think this is a good tool to use. If you're unsure or you want some perspective as to where certain opioids stack up against more potent opioids like fentanyl or weaker ones like codeine and tramadol, this is a good start. And this webinar is recorded. It's posted on our YouTube page. You could go back and you could refer to these slides at your own leisure. The confusion surrounding the different types of opioids, so to speak, is really my personal take on one of the many contributors to the opioid epidemic. But the more concerted and agreed upon contribution or cause, if you will, of the opioid epidemic starts in the 1990s, and three really key things happen. First, the campaign to implement pain as the fifth vital sign, in addition to body temperature, pulse, respiration, and blood pressure. This leads to a massive uptick in the prescription of opioids. And really it's due to this now increased obligation by the healthcare institution to manage patient pain more aggressively. If you look at the bottom right-hand side of the slide, you'll see this pain assessment tool, and when the fifth vital sign was adopted, you see these tools posted all across doctors' offices, hospitals, and really this was used to determine whether someone may or may not be prescribed opioids. And I think it would behoove someone to think that constantly suggesting you have worst pain possible, right, that 10 or that 7 to 9 range when you're already prescribed a potent opioid, wouldn't be surprising. And so what ends up happening is this merry-go-round of disastrous proportion, right? And you have people constantly saying that they're in more pain than they might be in because of the payoff of obviously being prescribed a very addictive substance. Second, Purdue Pharmaceutical marketed OxyContin as safe with low addictive potential. This is well documented, it's well known, it was a huge lie, totally false. If we look back to the scale of as far as potency goes, OxyContin is very high up there. It is incredibly addictive. You see shows and movies like Pain Hustlers and Dope Sick. It chronicles this event of a pharmaceutical company taking advantage of advertising falsely and being one of the main catalysts of the opioid epidemic today. Really, really disgusting, honestly, in my opinion. Third was the creation, manufacturing, and widespread distribution of street fentanyl that occurred somewhere around 2015. Before that, street fentanyl was really not a thing. And this is really the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the epidemic. But the epidemic was around long before street fentanyl hit. The CDC declared opioid as an epidemic around 2011 when prescription opioids peaked. And this is really believed to be in part due to these first two instances of the healthcare system being pressured to prescribe these at a more alarming rate or frequent rate, and pharmaceutical companies being part of that pressure. But as far as illicit fentanyl goes, this is believed to have originated in China and parts of India, and China and India persist as the main sources of influx into the U.S. today. And really the problem with fentanyl is that it's incredibly easy to manufacture. Growing opium is incredibly difficult. It's tedious, it's slow, it could only be done in certain environments and in certain countries, honestly. Fentanyl is made in a lab. There is no pure opium in it. It's easy to package, it's easy to import, export, it's odorless, it's more potent, so you need less of it. And it's really important to note that this is not medical grade fentanyl. I'm not saying that your local hospital or your local pharmacy is kind of responsible for this epidemic. Illicit fentanyl, street fentanyl, and medical grade fentanyl are different, but medical grade fentanyl is still dangerous, it's still very potent, it's still very addictive, but it's obviously controlled and regulated. Okay, some current trends right now in terms of opiate use disorder. In 2022, there were about 9 million U.S. adults who met criteria for opiate use disorder, and only about half of those received treatment in that year. And even less received medications that are very effective for treating opiate use disorder. And according to the research, the problem appears to be this lack of access to treatment across the board. And that could be for a variety of reasons. The stigma associated with seeking treatment, right? It's seen as this moral failing, which in my last webinar I talked about how that is obviously false. Or the fact that in some cases opioid use is obviously illegal. Heroin is not legal. Prescription opiate use is legal, but a lot of the times that leads to using other people's prescriptions, which becomes illegal. And lastly, like a lack of funding is always a barrier to treatment. America doesn't seem to have, let me rephrase that, our healthcare system isn't necessarily geared towards the treatment of addiction. Let's just say that. And the largest problem, really, that we're facing right now are overdose rates. When we talk about opioids, they were considered to have peaked in the year 2022, around 111,000 in the U.S. That number is as great as 600,000 globally, but with 70% of those being opioid related. And interestingly, the number of overdose deaths per year has slightly reduced in the last 2 years. And I read these two interesting articles about leading experts discussing and hypothesizing about the reason of this decrease. They actually aren't sure. They named some things like harm reduction strategies, the ending of COVID, a reduction in overall opioids being prescribed by doctors today. There's more restrictions and better access to medication-assisted treatment. So those were some of the ideas that were thrown around, but they're actually unsure. And if they can't capitalize on exactly what the reason is, they're fearful that these overdoses are going to continue to increase. In some of these slides, you'll see at the bottom that I linked our admission line here at Firetree. We do have detox services. We have a variety of residential services. It's a 24/7 line. We see that one of the main problems is barriers to treatment. So obviously we want to be part of the solution to that. If you know or are someone who needs treatment, feel free. Please do not hesitate to use that admission line. Okay, opioids and overdose. So opioids work on the part of the brain that controls breathing. And when you take an excess of opioids, something happens in terms of your brain being able to send signals to the rest of the body to tell it to continue to breathe. And what ends up happening is respiratory depression occurs. Some signs of overdose, or in other words, respiratory depression, include pinned pupils, unconsciousness, slowed breathing, difficulty breathing, choking, being limp, pale face, blue lips. And illicit fentanyl is thought to be the cause for more than half of these opioid overdose deaths. And we're at such an interesting time in history right now where illicit fentanyl has truly surpassed heroin in terms of like that dangerous drug that you think of, and in terms of usage. And so, on that same note, I have to always encourage individuals that fentanyl test strips are part of the harm reduction philosophy. They're effective and they're encouraged. They're also cheap. You can get them on Amazon. And in that same note, I cannot talk about fentanyl without stating these two facts: that it is 50 times stronger than heroin. 50 times stronger than heroin. That is crazy to think about, and 100 times stronger than morphine. And on that same note, I will say that there are no confirmed cases of overdose from just touching fentanyl and or being exposed to it secondhand. There's been much misrepresentation of this in the news, and much of it is false. And really, I say that to encourage you to never be apprehensive in helping someone who might be experiencing overdose because you fear that maybe coming into close proximity with them will cause you to overdose. There was a press release a few years ago by the American College of Medical Toxicology and the American Academy of Clinical Toxicology. They released this joint statement clarifying that fentanyl toxicity from incidental exposure was so unlikely as to be nearly impossible. So I found that reassuring, and something that I learned actually in doing this webinar. Prior to this, I was under the assumption that coming into close proximity with fentanyl could result in death due to it absorbing through your skin, you inhaling it. So that's certainly something I learned and something reassuring that is not true. But it still goes to show you that fentanyl is very much so potent. In no way am I advocating against that. It is incredibly strong and fatal if you do use it. Those who are most at risk for overdose include people who inject opioids opposed to snorting them or swallowing them. Individuals who use opioids after extended periods of sobriety, so following detox or an inpatient treatment stay, incarceration, or any period of time for which you're sober. What happens is your tolerance obviously goes down, and it's very difficult to figure out how low your tolerance has fallen, and then to determine how much opioids you need to use to get your desired results and not reach that threshold for respiratory depression is really impossible to determine. So this is where a lot of opiate overdose occurs, is immediately leaving treatment or after a period of sobriety, which is quite tragic. Lastly, combining opioids with other substances like alcohol, barbiturates, benzos, other depressants greatly increase your chance. You're just taking two depressants, so the odds of respiratory depression kind of double in terms of frequency. Who is most at risk for developing opiate use disorder? Well, I think anyone who experiences chronic pain regularly or may be receiving long-term pain management will be at the top of the list. Opioids do not discriminate, and if you take them for long enough, you will become dependent on them. Men are most at risk for developing opiate use disorder, but women are actually more likely to be prescribed. I thought that was interesting. Those with co-occurring mental health disorders are at increased risk. Opioids are a pain reliever, and it's not only physical pain, but they certainly relieve emotional pain as well. Because they are euphoric, they make you feel good. And this is often an outlet or a short-term remedy for people struggling with mental health. Those who have first-degree family members, like parents with substance use disorder, are at more of an increased risk. There are genetic elements to this. Those who are unemployed, those who don't attend college, those who are in poverty, those who are incarcerated at any point, are all at increased risks. And in my last webinar, we looked at the different models of addiction, and one of the takeaways was that there is no one cause for addiction. And one must truly consider the biological, psychological, sociological, and even spiritual contributors to opiate use disorder. This is something that we actively try to address while in treatment. Um, there are signs and there are flags and there are markers. You just need to use process of elimination and really figure out which is most prevalent. And kind of ask, like, what does your family history look like in terms of substance use disorder? How's your physical health? Are you in pain? What does your environment look like? Are you in areas that have high drug use and high drug distribution? Do you surround yourself with individuals, friends, family members who use? Do you have purpose in this world? Do you have a sense of belonging? How is your emotional health and your psychological health? All of these things kind of matter and add up when we talk about contributors to opiate use disorder. So diagnosing opiate use disorder, you must meet DSM-5 criteria, and 2 of the following criteria must be present for at least 12 months. And some of the things you'll see are the individual's use of opioids despite negative consequences, right? Despite health problems, despite loved ones pleading with them that this is wrong, and you'll see job performance and attendance both decline. You'll notice that they're not around as much. Acquiring drugs, takes lots of time out of people's days. Standard tolerance increase. This happens across the board. There are no exceptions to tolerance. If you start taking opioids, no matter who you are, your tolerance will increase. You will need more to reach the desired effects over time, and eventually physical dependence will occur. And every 12 hours or so, without opioids, the body will go into a state of physical withdrawal, much like having flu or fever-like symptoms until you redose with another opioid. And one of my intended takeaways from this webinar is for you to understand why your loved one is doing this to themselves. And the truth is that opioids make you feel very good. And most of the time when you ask someone struggling why they use, it's the answer is often because it feels good. I get that 90% of the time. Opioids bring immediate pleasure and a large amount of it. And for many of us, life is boiled down to just that, which is moving away from pain and moving towards pleasure. Let's talk about pain for a second. According to the CDC, about 21% of U.S. adults report being in pain. That's 51 million people. And that's just talking about physical pain. If you ask yourself, are you in pain right now? Physical pain, emotional pain, psychological pain, spiritual pain, social pain. Many of you would probably answer yes to that question. And for some, opioids are an outlet for that and relief. And so this is where the brain really comes into play and why we call this a disease. For thousands of years, our brains have adapted for survival. One of the main neurotransmitters responsible for that is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter responsible for pleasure, reward, motivation, memory, and learning. It's released when we eat food, when we drink water, when we procreate, when we make a friend, when you hug a family member, anything that you do that is considered pleasurable. 9 times out of 10, that is also good for your survival. So dopamine plays a key role in creating these memories and ensuring that it tells the brain to continue doing the things that bring it pleasure because it's good for our survival. Our brains have something called a baseline level of dopamine. A certain amount of dopamine is released based on how pleasurable a stimulus is. And our brains then create this hierarchy of survival, where more dopamine is released for the things that are more important for our survival, right? For example, more dopamine is released, or more pleasure is released when we eat food in comparison to exercise. When we use substances like opioids, this is often releasing 10 times the normal amount of dopamine. So your brain shifts its values very, very quickly. And what we see in chronic cases is opioids take that number one spot above food, where food falls to 2, water falls to 3, sleep falls to 4. And so I get pushback on this. And the counter argument is always, well, our body literally needs food, water, and sleep to survive. You don't actually need opioids to survive. If an addict does not get an opioid, they will not die. And that is true. But our brains do not know the difference. Our brain does not know that. Our limbic system has restructured itself due to this repeated use. It now sees your substance of choice as more important than food, water, and sleep. And if we look back to the picture on the previous slide, we see this interplay between two very important areas of the brain, the limbic system, where dopamine is made, and our prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is what's called our lizard brain. You might have referred to that before. Among other things, and for a lack of a better term really, it's responsible for two things, pleasure and survival. And then there's this neural pathway between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system that helps regulate immediate primal urges. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision-making, impulse control, empathy, emotion regulation, consideration for other people, maintaining social appropriateness, higher levels of thought. It's truly what makes us human, separates us from animals. So where am I going with this? In times of crisis, the limbic system is stronger, and it will bypass the prefrontal cortex, right, that human part of our brain. When a bear is attacking you, for example, or you're trying to defend yourself, you don't sit there and wait for your prefrontal cortex to kind of go through the process of elimination of, well, how's this going to affect that person or the bear, or what's society going to think of this if I attack this bear, and how's this going to affect my future or my health, right? We don't think of that in those times. They're rare occurrences. But the thing is, when we're in active addiction, we stop using this pathway altogether because our brain thinks we're in this state of survival, right? When a bear is attacking us or someone's trying to assault us. We no longer consider how our addiction is affecting others. It's affecting our health, how it's going to affect our future, how society is perceiving us, how others are viewing us. And just like a road that is no longer being used, this pathway kind of shrivels up and goes away altogether. And this is where treatment comes in. Treatment aims to reestablish these neural pathways, create new ones or reestablish old ones through structure and abstinence. We're trying to build new behaviors. But opiate use disorder, as I mentioned before, is unique from other substances. It has that physical element of dependence, which takes form of physical withdrawal symptoms, right? You get sick when you don't have it. Because of this, detox is required, and this separates it from other drugs. The only other drugs that require a detox as well as alcohol and benzos. Detox is a barrier for individuals struggling with opiate use disorder. Only 5% of inpatient treatment centers around the U.S. offer detox. It's something that's certainly that we're short on. Detox is a 24/7 medically managed facility that monitors individuals as they go through this process. There's usually medical staff on staff 24/7 because this does not stop at night or during the day. Opioid detox lasts about 7 to 14 days. Could be shorter, could be longer. It's truly dependent, but that's typically what we see, that 7 to 14 day mark. And that's just the physical, right? The physical withdrawal symptoms. The psychological last much longer than that, but that does not require detox. And that's what we refer to as post-acute withdrawal symptoms, or PAWS, P-A-W-S. And repeated opiate use damages this dopaminergic system that I was talking about before. And our brains are no longer producing dopamine for the things that they should be producing dopamine for. When you eat your favorite food, when you're watching television, when you're engaging with a family member, you're in this state of anhedonia where nothing is bringing you pleasure because you've sort of broken that mechanism for the time being. It has now become dependent on this exogenous substance for pleasure, which is the opioid. So this takes the form, post-acute withdrawal symptom, it takes the form of stress, depression, lethargy, irritability, trouble focusing, trouble sleeping, and you'll see those symptoms last long after detox. And it interferes with treatment adherence. It interferes with individuals remaining in treatment as well. And this is where medication-assisted treatment comes in. The addicted brain is in this weakened and survivalist state, and focusing on treatment, building coping skills, going to group, resilience, talking to your counselor is very difficult when you're in that frame of mind, even after a 7-day detox. So the brain is sending these strong signals that it's starving for an opioid. And the only thing you could really think of is, I need my drug of choice, I need my drug of choice, I need my drug of choice, which makes focusing on treatment nearly impossible. So MAT eliminates those symptoms and allows the individual to reach sort of this neutral state, right? They're not high, they're not in withdrawal, kind of back to normal. I like to use that word. See, we're a little over. I want to thank everyone for being here today and taking the time. I hope you learned something and you took something away from this. On the note of MAT, I do a webinar specifically on MAT that I might end up running again in the near future. So if you're curious to know more about that, that should be happening in the near future. And as always, if you guys are interested in certain topics, please reach out in the chat or what have you. And on the same note of treatment, detox, inpatient, residential, outpatient, our next webinar will go in depth into the treatment process that I touched on here today, and that will take place on November 19th. So again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time and being here. Hope you learned something. I see there's a question here. I see it. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. I hope to see you guys next time, and enjoy your days. Okay.